I'm running. So much time wasted in 17 years inside a fence. I ran from the war, homeless, no school, no future. I'm a ghost, but not finished. I will run.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining today's virtual convening. We are delighted to see you all and are very pleased to see names and faces that have become familiar in our virtual gatherings. My name is Maríñez-Lora, and I'm a research assistant professor at the Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice at the University of Chicago and the chair of the Coalition Convening Planning Work Group. As a coalition, we want to acknowledge with respect and gratitude all communities and Indigenous people, particularly the original peoples that still reside here. Our coalition work is guided by the rich diversity of backgrounds, identities, experiences, needs, strengths, and expertise of our members. In our convenings, we strive to increase our understanding of the experiences of the various groups we strive to represent and how individually and in groups we can be helpful. The title of today's convening is Supporting Refugee Children and Youth's Transition to School. The focus of today's convening is on the school experiences and mental health implications for a particular set of children and youth. Those with refugee status, seeking asylum, and undocumented and unaccompanied minors. However, before proceeding with our convening, we feel compelled to acknowledge that the most recent and older school shootings highlight that schools are not always safe places for children. Please take a moment with me to pay respect to the victims of the school shooting in Uvalde, Texas. Thank you. Before starting, I want to thank the other members of the convening planning work group, Maria Ferreira, Virginia Quiñones, Dana Rush, Kanjit Gurma, Benjamin Drury, and Daisy Diaz-Strong for their contributions to our gatherings. I also want to thank our co-sponsor, the Center for Community Health Equity at DePaul University and Rush University, and Ben Drury, Executive Director of the Chicago Education Advocacy Cooperative, for providing all our tech support. Excuse me. I also want to quickly share with you the format of today's convening. Our wonderful panel of speakers will each have a chance to talk. This will be followed by a Q&A. You will be muted for the duration of today's event. Please submit your comments and questions via the chat box to me and to Ben Drury. Our first speaker is Nate Sivak. Nate is the Youth Education Coordinator at RefugeeOne, a resettlement agency in Chicago. Born in Illinois, Nate first encountered refugee work 10 years ago in Tunisia and Southern Italy. He graduated from the College of William and Mary with a BA in Religious and Mediterranean Studies. For the past 5 years, Nate has led over after-school programs, enrichment activities, and bridge the gap between schools and refugee families in Chicago. He continues his work with a renewed passion after the events transpiring over the last year that have displaced thousands of people in Eurasia. Nate?
Good morning, everyone. I should say millions of people displaced in Eurasia. It's a pleasure to be here, folks. I have to say this right now, my street has been very active this morning. A lot of car alarms were going off, so pardon me if you start to hear a marching band outside. And I'm starting my timer because I do have a tendency to ramble. So here we go. All right. Can everybody see my screen?
We can. Is it meant to be a white rectangle?
No.
Okay.
Can you see it now? It should say students in transition.
It still says it's still just a white rectangle.
Okay, hold on one second.
Sorry.
All right. Let's see. How about now? Anything?
Not yet,
No.
Nate. When you click on that share screen, what do you see?
It says your screen sharing is paused right now.
All right.
Resume share.
So go ahead and do an unshare
Okay.
or stop sharing,
Okay.
and let's try it again. So click on that share screen.
Okay.
Well, first off, hold on a second. Do you have your PowerPoint open on your computer?
Yes. How about
Good.
now? People see this?
Okay, there you go.
Excellent.
Yes.
Hooray.
Excellent.
Hey, we did
Excellent.
it. Amazing.
Okay.
Why? I am the guinea pig. Okay, folks. Students in transition. Let's bring it back to the top. To the top. Okay, so the main points here. We're going to look first into a hopefully brief introduction or overview of refugee resettlement, and talking about what a refugee is versus the other types of migratory statuses. And then we'll get into education before resettlement and some of the challenges and successes we see at school as well as at home. And then talking about the future and also what it means in relation to the community. It takes a village. All right. So first off, what is a refugee? Refugee is often used as this like umbrella term for anyone who is displaced, but it does carry some legal status and meaning. So a refugee legally is someone who is unable to return to their country of residence, and they apply for their refugee status outside of the country that they're trying to resettle into, such as the USA. An asylum seeker is very similar. This is a displaced person who applies for refugee status when they enter the country that they're trying to resettle in, such as the USA. Internally displaced person is a person who simply is forced from their home, but within their home country. A returnee is someone who finally returns to their home country. And then a stateless person, which is perhaps one of the most vulnerable statuses you can have, is someone who does not legally have a nationality. And so some stateless people are refugees, but not all refugees are stateless people. All right, moving right along. So again, quick overview of refugee resettlement. Basically, a prospective individual or family applies for refugee status through the UN or through an embassy for a country. So that's the first part. There's a screening process, priority 1, if you're referred by the UN, priority 2, if you have a special humanitarian concern, SIV or parolee, something that folks have heard nowadays with the Afghanistan crisis. These are statuses for SIV for a special visa if you maybe helped the US government, in many cases translators for the US military. And parolee is an emergency residency in the USA where people can apply for asylum. So very briefly, the big difference between displaced folks like refugees or asylum seekers is that they are forced to leave versus immigrants and migrants who choose to leave. So a lot of people don't realize when refugees are applying for this special status of refugee status, that they spend an average of 17 years in refugee camps. And currently the resettlement screening process can take up to 2.5 years at minimum. A lot of times it takes much longer than this. And shockingly, only 1% of refugees are usually ever resettled. We have many folks, say Congolese refugees who are just waiting in camps in like Tanzania, in Nyarugusu and Kigoma, many of whom have children in those camps. So many people who have fled the Democratic Republic of Congo and then start their new lives in camps. And then maybe 20 years later, they are finally resettled. So where are most of our refugees coming from? Many over the past 5 years have come from Syria. Well, sorry, these are internally displaced folks, one moment. So just to bring it back. So most of our folks right now are coming from Afghanistan, from Syria, from the Congo, like I mentioned, as well as Rohingya Muslims from Burma. And then we also have folks from Sudan and smaller population Sudan and the Horn of Africa, Eritrea. We also are getting folks from Central America, folks from Honduras, and also from South America, Venezuela. So I do have some visuals here, but for the sake of time, I'm going to give you a moment to look at them and then move right along into the main focus of my job, which is school, and being a liaison between the schools and the refugee families. So this is by the numbers here, folks who are forcibly displaced in the world. This is 82.4 million. At this time, really, after the Ukraine crisis, it's more like 100 million or more than 100 million who have been internally displaced and forcibly displaced. Some of these folks are refugees. Some of these are asylum seekers. This is an overlook of US refugee admissions for the country. So you can see, I think it's really notable, before really 9/11, before 2001, we averaged in the hundreds of thousands of refugees being resettled in the country. And then after 9/11, we see much smaller numbers. And then of course, very small numbers during the Trump presidency to 15,000 being admitted into the country. So there's a ceiling. This is the number that is like our quota of refugees coming into the country, and then which is represented by the blue line here. And then the orange line is how many people actually entered the country. So as you can see, in the later 2010s, there was a ceiling, a quota, but the actual number of folks who came in was very small. But now, of course, these numbers are going up. All right. For the sake of time, I'm going to usher in our school portion here. So I see here, and hopefully you can have these slides to look at after this. But so let's talk about education for a lot of our refugees before resettlement. We have many different school experiences with our refugees. Many come from very stable academic backgrounds. Some have never been to school. Some are completely illiterate, but even illiterate folks may know 5 or 8 different languages. Not all of the schools that they went to before coming to the USA kept records. They were often had interrupted education. The pandemic, of course, was an interruption faced by the entire world. But of course, there were other cases such as war and hazardous environments. A lot of times there were experiences of corruption. We've had stories from many of our refugee students who talked about a pay-to-play system at their schools where they had to pay in order to get a diploma or higher education, or just to go to school every day. And in some cases, there was corporal punishments at schooling. So if something was wrong, disciplinary actions often came in the form of some sort of physical abuse. So let's talk about some of the challenges that we're seeing at school here in the USA, and specifically in Chicago. So this is really my wheelhouse here. I'm youth education coordinator, so I serve as the liaison between the refugee families and the schools. Some of the big challenges that we see right off the bat is language proficiency, and this is just common for any refugees or immigrants coming in here. There are very different levels of English that our students have, and many of whom experience some sort of discrimination because of this difference. And of course, depending on their ethnic background, we see that as well. But we also see it on both sides of the coin. We see a lot of our students having certain reservations or stereotypes of the kids who they meet at school as well. So it does go both ways. I don't have it on there, but we also have the issue of having insensitivity from our teachers and counselors at school. And this can also be based on the religious differences that we have with our students at our schools, or certain expectations for favoring certain holidays and having days off and everything, and also how we dress, modesty, things like this. Another challenge is cultural nuance, such as certain words being used, hand gestures. A lot of our kids may see, signs being thrown, and not realizing that they have to do with gangs, or they may even hear words that they think are fine to say out loud because they hear it in music or in the hallway, such as the N-word. A lot of things that can actually get them in trouble if they don't really understand the context of it. Another huge issue we have is age. A lot of our kids come to school or want to go to school, and they may be 18 or 19, and by 22, you legally cannot be in high school. So many of our kids, if they do not have any credit or records, they will not be able to go to high school. So this is often an issue. But what is working? What is working in the schools? Customized curriculums. Again, there's a varying different education and language proficiency. And so having the patience with our school administration and with our teachers to actually sit down one-on-one and figure out what this person needs. We've had amazing success stories in some of our schools where teachers make packets and little language dictionaries and guides for like the sounds of the alphabet from, say, Pashto or Dari or Rohingya to English. These are huge and they really help a lot. Having social emotional healing spaces. One of our schools has a huge part of their library set for just having a safe space for their kids to stay if they're feeling overwhelmed or if they just need a place to relax. Student guides, this is a term that one of our schools use. It's these individuals at schools who act as intermediaries between refugees or migrants who may be immigrants or refugees themselves and speak the language. And they really walk between two worlds and they help adjust and transition new arrivals to the school and to the culture. Serving food that reflects the student body, such as halal food, which some of our schools are now doing. And then meetings with community leaders to discuss hopes and dreams for the school environment, what is working, what is not working. Give a very brief example. We had an issue in one of our groups where one of these student guides was leading a discussion and then became the target of a lot of these newcomers because they didn't like the way that she dressed and thought it was immodest and not to standard or to religious standard. And so we brought in a community leader who really helped negotiate this whole process together. So it's been very exciting to see that flexibility within the schools and also outside of the schools. And I know I'm really at time, but I want to go over the challenges at home that also deeply affect the situation at school. So some of the biggest challenges we see at home: work. Our refugees only have 3 months to start providing money and support at home. So they get a 3-month buffer and then they go into the workforce. So oftentimes a lot of our older kids have to also go into the workforce. Different understandings of relationships between the parents and the teachers. Maybe in the home countries, a lot of the parents believe that teachers were both disciplinarians and educators at the school, and that world was separate than the world at home. Whereas here in the USA, there's a much more collaborative relationship between the school and the home. Many of our parents cannot read or write or had very little education. So not having the know-how how to support the students at home creates a lot of tension and pressure. Having reliable internet in the age of remote schooling and in this age of technology is a huge issue. I know I have to finish up. And then of course, having space and privacy. We have many large families. And so very quickly, what's working: therapy, one-on-one, group therapy at home, having folks from the community come to support the students with home tutoring and youth mentorship, especially for our teens and young adults, to help them navigate these new spaces. And of course, introducing them to welcoming public spaces like libraries. I am at time, but at the end, I will say the cliche: it takes a village. Bringing people into the community and creating those networks will only help our young people in the future. So again, sorry for my tech difficulties in the beginning. I appreciate you guys. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Nate, for providing us with a great deal of context about global displacement, refugee resettlement, and students' experiences prior to and after arrival, and for reviewing what is working, which is very important. Your presentation provides a solid backdrop for our other speakers. Our next speaker is Beata Arceo. Beata Arceo was born, raised, and educated in Poland. She graduated from Catholic University of Lublin, Poland, with a BA in Humanities and an MA in Literature and Education. She received training in political studies and leadership at the John Abbott College in Quebec, Canada. She studied abroad on Japanese language and culture at the Eurocenters in Kanazawa, Japan. She had an internship on human rights, fundamental freedoms, and leadership at the Council of Europe, EYC, Strasbourg, France. She has been working in Chicago Public Schools since 1997, first at the high school level and then in central administration. She has been in charge of the Foreign Student Services Unit since 2011. She is responsible for the enrollment process, placement, and programming of newcomer students. She creates guidelines and manages international programs. She also teaches cultural sensitivity, immigration trends, and on Chicago Public Schools procedures. In addition, she advises on global education and communication. Beata?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And I know my timer is on, so I will be really fast because I have a lot of things to show. So I run this little shop in Chicago Public Schools. I am a part of Office of Language and Cultural Education, and I am in charge of foreign student and newcomer services. And if you look at the website, there are like main responsibilities of all the international programs that Chicago Public Schools has available. And part of it will be also taking care of immigrant children. Many of my colleagues from resettlement agencies know me when they contact me regarding placement in the school, evaluation of foreign credentials, and making decisions how the student should be placed and how the student should be programmed. So this is a big responsibility of my office: enrollment, placement, programming of the students. In our office, we do a lot of research about other countries, other educational systems. So we know exactly how to compare the system. And when we are evaluating the previous education of the student, we are comparing curricula. So we are able to place the student in the starting point when it will be beneficial for the student. We do research, of course, on all the political situations, changes, and trying to be proactive. So we know when a certain group is arriving, we are making sure that our schools are aware of it, that they receive information, material, and training about that new group that is coming to our schools. We did quite extensive training, for example, regarding Afghani families that we received this year, and our schools were really receive all the students with open arms and calling me before even the families arrived here. We did now a little bit of preparations for the Ukrainian arrival, but that arrival did not happen. Training. So the training, we start really with training of parents, how immigrant parents can find themselves in a reality of urban educational system, how to be prepared, how to function in a completely different system, coming from rural areas, coming from small towns, and as Nate mentioned before, for a completely different environment and relationships within the home and official schools. So we do training for parents. Then we train staff in the school. So we do training for school clerks, how to be welcoming, how to be culturally sensitive, how to be prepared to receive families which are coming from different backgrounds, do not speak English, and all this whole enchilada for clerks. Then we train counselors, and we talk a lot about the background, about how to be sensitive, how to understand where they are coming from, how they came to United States. Then we train principals also. We train network chiefs, so they know that what they have in their network and how to support those families. In last school year and in this school year, I also did training for city colleges. I'm trying for years to encourage them to have services for students who are over age and we are not able to serve them them anymore. And I am trying to convince them to create programs that they will be better and focus on this kind of students, even with some vocational programs at the end of the education. So training is really on many different levels. And then there is a counseling, because families coming to our office very often ask questions. So we give them an overview, how it works, what they should do, how they should deal with certain problems, with their own problems, finding themselves in the new community. Our main goal for any student coming from outside of United States, legal, illegal, it doesn't absolutely make any difference to us, is that every child is entitled to equal access to public education. And I am the enforcer. If there is any problem in the school with the access to free education, we will interfere very fast. I think after at least 15 years of a really very, very intense training, there is really known school in our school district that will have that problem. They might have questions which they will direct to us, but not problem with enrolling any student to public school in the city of Chicago. And, you know, doing our trainings, we talk, Nate mentioned that already, we talk a lot about the adaptation process, about the family obligations, about the parent and student relationships in many different cultures, how it differs from the relationships, expectations they are in here in United States. We talk about the gaps in their education, adjustment to new culture, and we are also trying to tell them about addressing the post-traumatic stress that they are experiencing or experience on the way to United States. Everybody's asking me, how many students you have from this country, from that country, how many refugees, how many? Well, I have to tell you the truth, we have no idea. And we have no idea because we have problem with our data. For usually, I have like a little screenshot what we were asking families coming from other countries enrolling in our schools. It was very helpful to us if we knew from what country they are, if this is the first enrollment to schools, if they have any previous education, you know, in which country they were born, what language they speak at home. But then you know, we were attacked and criticized that we are collecting too much information and it could be harmful. And then I think the top of the cake was when our previous CEO was in Washington, and she was asked, you know, how many students do you have? How many are illegal? Do they have one parent, more parents, and this kind of things, which she could not answer anyway, because we never kept really data on it. This is not our interest. We just need to know if there is somebody who is legally responsible for the child, but how many parents and what is their situation? We never kept that data. Anyway, she decided we're not gonna do it. So overnight, that possibility of keeping that data was removed. So we don't know. That's the situation, which is from our perspective is really not good, and it really blocked us and not allow us to deliver certain services because we don't have really good data. So our data at the moment is English learners. So we know if the children are have limited English abilities, then they are in the bilingual programs. So we know that 22.1% of students in CPS are English learners, and this is a big percentage. It's more even that students who are diverse learners. So this is a pretty big group, but not all of those students are really immigrants, refugee students, because some of them might not speak English, but they were already born in the United States. So that percentage is also really not precise. We know, I was just checking our data, we have 144 languages, representation of that many languages in our school district. We have 360 schools with full bilingual programs, 85 with partial bilingual programs, and we have 42 dual language schools of course, those dual language schools are dual with English and Spanish, since this is our biggest community. Anne was asking me about graduation. So the graduation rate of our English learners is not that great, but it is going up. And you know, within circumstances of the students that we lately receive, I think we are little by little moving ahead. That low graduation rate is, you know, has a bigger background and more complex background, but it is improving, and hopefully it will be improving year to year. And I'm really hoping that before I retire from Chicago Public Schools, we will have at least 96% of graduation rates. So I keep track of students that I help to enroll in schools, and those are in elementary schools, in high school. So you know, we have a United Nations in Chicago Public Schools, definitely. Yearly, we receive students from approximately 85 countries. Usually it will be yearly around 75 different language groups. So this is a very diverse, very colorful, very interesting, dynamic, and extremely resistant group of students and families coming to our district. In the COVID time, obviously we experienced huge drop in enrollment. It was around 60%. Majority of the students, we were still though receiving students coming to Chicago. They were students, for example, coming, they were the students from Mexico who were born in the United States, but then they moved with the families in Mexico. In Mexico, students born in the United States are discriminated. They have problems with access to education. And because pandemic started to be really dangerous, the families felt better to send those kids to distant families in the United States and attend the school here. So we received a lot of students kind of reuniting with us, because many of them were former CTS students. So we're happy to receive them back in public schools. And the other group, those were students who were released from the border. So students who were already received by the agencies, by the shelters, and the shelters were releasing them. And we received quite a lot of students and unaccompanied minors during that time of COVID. Going back to refugee students. So again, we don't really know how many of them we received this year. We received 188 refugee students, and we know that because those were students served by resettlement agencies here in the city of Chicago. So this is the information that we have from them, because otherwise we don't have that information in our system. They might be more students, because very often refugee families are coming here without assistance of resettlement agency. So this is 0.0% of student population. This is a small group in elementary, majority them in elementary schools. We do also the training regarding those students. So we tell our school personnel in which schools they are, where they came from, and you know, all that training that I was mentioning before, that also happens regarding refugee students. I know that I already going low on time, but I would like to talk to you very fast about the new families coming to Chicago Public Schools, because they are big concern of mine, and I feel that those families, especially from Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and in our school district is mostly Guatemala, are left without really support. As refugees families coming here and helped by resettlement agencies received at least the beginning help, and also very often we receive families. So those students have the family support, emotional support. They have a house. When our students, the students coming from Guatemala, really do not have it. Majority of them do not have it. So they are very often trafficked to the border of Mexico. They are coming through 3 corridors. I personally visited the corridor coming from Chiapas. Tapachula is a blow mining place for all those people crossing and going by the Pacific Ocean to the borders in United States. So this is really stable, quiet arrival. This arrival to United States doesn't have the political clout, the political support. People are not calling me and telling me, oh, I would like to receive this family, as the regular people calling me from Chicago. They wanted to help Afghanis, they wanted to help others. Nobody wants to help the kids from Guatemala. They are a majority boys. They are majority from 15, 16, 17 years old. And as they are coming from Central America, majority will receive them, as I mentioned, are from Guatemala. And you know, they have a chance really to apply for the special for the asylum. They qualify for asylum. They qualify for special immigrant juvenile status, U visa, T visa. The problem is, are they really applying for those visas? Do they have any support really to direct them to apply for that status? Because my experience is that they are coming to the United States, they are placed in completely inappropriate houses. They have no support. Yes, Anne, I see it, and they do not apply for any visa or status that they are eligible for here in the United States. So after a certain amount of time, they do not show up in the immigration court, and they are going to the underground. And this is very tragic, because they are very, very young people, and this is like another lost generation, living in horrible conditions without any support. They really do not want to go to school. You know, if you have time later to read this statement from one of the boys who wrote, they asked him about himself and what he wants like to do in United States. I translated it absolutely literally. And what he says, and they don't want to go to school. They are sent here to work, but then they are placed, and their requirement is, because they are minors, that they have to go to school. And you know, we have this kind of disconnect feeling. Should we really respect their wishes and the wishes of their families, or because they are minors, should we really push them and go and receive education, receive some kind of diploma, some kind of vocational certificate, which will allow them to have better life in the United States, which will allow them also to go to courts to really clarify and stabilize their immigration status in United States. So there's always that conflict that many of the administrators also are feeling. What should we do with those kids? Because they are enrolling in our schools, and they attend 2-3 days, and then we cannot find them. They will never show up, but they have a confirmation that they are enrolled in high school, which hopefully they will use when they go to the federal court to apply for their status, but we don't know if it really is happening. Another thing
I'm sorry,
really
Beata, we are running out of time.
Just one more second. You know, because many of the folks are working in the resettlement agencies. And, you know, when I see in the verification of release that the student is placed in with unrelated sponsor, this is a really red flag, because those unrelated sponsors, they have responsibilities, as you see, and they are completely unqualified to take care of those children. I was talking to the organization in Pilsen, where the Guatemalan community is growing. I was talking to organizations who see the Guatemalan families, but they really don't have contact with them. But they have some stories, because they came for free food, that in houses, 10 boys are sleeping on the floor with one girl, because the students, all of them, were released to unrelated sponsor. So how can you expect those children to go to school and to do anything? So I am just talking about it everywhere. You wanted to, Anna wanted me to talk about Ukraine. I will just say that, you know, I don't have to explain it to you what it is. I will also only tell you that there are no refugees from Ukraine. They don't have refugee status in United States. We enrolled 85 students, and all of them came here based on sponsorship, because this whole United for Ukraine program, this is not a refugee support. If you want to come to United States, you have to have a financial sponsor in United States. So United States government will not spend a dime for helping people escaping war in Ukraine. So there is no such thing as at the moment as Ukrainian refugees. I am sorry, Amy, that I took some of your time, hopefully not. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Beata, for the overview of the support services provided by CPS Foreign Student Service Units, and for sharing your experiences and concerns about undocumented, unaccompanied minors. I want to just kind of move on so that Amy can have as much time as possible. Go ahead, Amy. I'm going to just read your bio very quickly. Okay. Amy Hill has worked with refugee and immigrant youth and families for over 15 years. She currently serves as the program manager for the Kovler Center Child Trauma Program, a program of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, where she oversees all clinical case management and complementary services for refugee and immigrant youth and their families. Additionally, Amy has served on the board of services for refugee, on the board of directors for the Chicago Burmese Community Association and Suresteem, and has volunteered abroad working with youth and or refugees in Kenya, Guatemala, and Israel. She has a master's degree in child development from the Erickson Institute and a master's of social work from Loyola University.
Thank you. And should I try to keep it to about 7 minutes? Are we going until 11 or 11:15?
We're going into 11:15. If folks can stay until 11:30 so that we can have more Q&A, that would be great.
Okay.
But I would say, take 10 minutes. You prepared for a little bit more. It's so that you can.
Okay.
But I'm gonna kind of let you know when you have 9 minutes so you can wrap up. How's that?
Sure. Sounds great.
Okay.
And everybody can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to be talking today about how we can support the emotional well-being of refugee and immigrant children. As Anne mentioned, I'm a social worker and a trauma therapist, and I provide individual and group therapy to refugee and asylum-seeking children at the Kovler Center Child Trauma Program. But my work with children started long before I became a therapist, and these earlier experiences really have informed my views on emotional healing and well-being for children just as much as my graduate studies. So, oops, let's see, how do we advance? There we go. So this slide just shows some of the experiences that have informed my clinical work with children. I've had a variety of roles around the world with kids, teacher, friend, coach, mentor, advocate, and most recently therapist. And because of this variety of experiences that I've had working with children and families, I am a therapist who believes very strongly that one does not need to be a therapist in order to be therapeutic. So of course, I've seen therapy have a significant impact on the well-being and resilience of children, but I've also seen the ways in which caring adults, such as Nate and Beata, who I've had the pleasure of working with for many years, community connections, opportunities for socialization, these things are critical to children's healing. So when thinking about this presentation, I thought it would be most impactful to hear from the experts on this topic, the kids themselves. So I reached out to some kids who I worked with at RefugeeOne, which is where I worked for many years before the Kovler Center. And these kids are young adults now. And I asked them, what helps you the most as kids to feel safe and happy in the United States? So in the interest of time, I won't read their quotes, but you can see them here. But some of the things that I'd like to just highlight are, they talk about the after school program being a place of safety, where they could connect with other students who had similar backgrounds, didn't feel judged, didn't feel alone, and having that sense of community was really critical to their well-being, as well as just seeing other kids like them, refugee kids, doing normal things, doing healthy, normal daily things, getting that sense of just stability and normalcy was critical to their forward movement in this new place. So another more slightly formal way of naming what these kids are describing is essentially to be trauma informed, right? To create an environment that supports healing and promotes resilience. You don't have to be a therapist to create a trauma-informed space. A school, an after-school program, a neighborhood center, all of these can and do have healing therapeutic components. And if you go back and look at the quotes from these kids, you can see that these 6 principles of a trauma-informed approach really come through in their words, right? They talk about safety, being able to trust people, peer support, being, getting healing through the relationships in their community, other kids and people from their backgrounds, collaboration, that healing happens in relationships, right? And being empowered to make choices in their lives. And of course, incredibly important is being attuned to the cultural, historical, linguistic, and gender considerations, and leveraging the healing power of the cultural practices that our families bring with them. So let's talk about the background, and we've heard a bit already from my colleagues here about the experiences that refugees had before they come to the United States. We refer to it as this triple trauma paradigm of forced migration. Pre-flight, they might have, years of violence and instability, but in their home country, at least they have maybe their family connections, their cultural, spiritual practices, and stability, and this fortifies them. Then the traumatic experiences that can come through flight, the escape, the uncertainty, the potential along the way for danger and exploitation. And then post-flight, I think a lot of people think of resettlement as, they finally arrived in the promised land, or this is how other people maybe see it, everything should be great now. But the reality is the post-flight, which is here in the United States, there's feelings of loss, isolation, coping with maybe now being in a marginalized status, worrying about those they left behind. And I really think that we underestimate how traumatic this post-flight or resettlement period can be. Think about what our families have lost, their culture, their community, a sense of belonging. Time with their family is lost because now they might have long commutes or grueling work schedules, a sense of competence in understanding just the basic things about how things work, even very basic things like nature and the weather. And then, of course, for youth of color, they encounter our pervasive and systemic racism. A young woman from a country in West Africa once told me that only after arriving in America did she learn that she is, quote, not a pretty girl because I'm not light-skinned. I always thought I was fine until I came here. On the topic of racism, this is another example of how the pervasiveness of racism within the United States, within the context of immigration, comes through. This article in the New York Times addresses the very concerning issue of Ukrainian children being separated at the border from non-parental caregivers. But you can see in the second paragraph that I have here, it says, the brunt of the law that led to the separation of children from their caregivers, has been felt by Central American children, the largest group of minors to reach the border in recent years and who are often fleeing gang violence. But those children typically are aware of the policy and know that they will be taken into temporary custody. For Ukrainian children, the separation from their caretakers has been an unexpected, shocking twist in their escape from a war zone. I've worked with Central American unaccompanied minors. I've worked with unaccompanied minors from around the world to state that children from Central America knew that they would be separated, and to imply that somehow when the trauma happens to these kids, it's somehow not as bad as what happens to the Ukrainian children is at best false, and at worst, just another example of the pervasive ways that racist tropes are embedded in our discourse. Separation from caregivers is traumatizing, no matter your cultural heritage, your skin color, your background. And this passage reminded me of a quote from Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands. Americans have lived under a strange and contradictory delusion. Black bodies are incredibly strong and frightening and impervious to pain. They can handle anything short of total destruction, but white bodies are extremely weak and vulnerable, especially to Black bodies. I think I've seen examples that I won't share now because of time, but of the ways in which racism shows up in deferential treatment, even amongst immigrant and refugee populations. As white service providers especially, we need to bring into our awareness the ways in which immigrant youth of color experience racism, and we need to create safe spaces for them. So how do we support refugee and immigrant youth as they navigate this new traumatic environment while still carrying the trauma from their past? I think it's helpful for me to think of this human resilience equation. This speaks to this fancy word allostatic load, which essentially just means the cumulative burden of chronic stress or stressful life events, essentially risk factors. But the good news is that enhancing protective factors or resilience factors for kids balances things out and lowers that allostatic load, which in turn lowers their vulnerability to physical illness as well as psychological illness. Some children may need the help of a professional. Oh, 1 minute. Okay, moving right along. So some children may need professional help to enhance their protective factors, but as I've said, some will get that enhancement just through social connections, community, caring adults. And this is a slide I share when I do psychoeducation for refugee families, that there are so many healthy habits that we have embedded in our culture, in our traditions, that these things are things that can build our resilience and help us to move forward with good health. So maybe I'm just going to skip forward here to share a quote from a child, an 8-year-old asylum seeker at the conclusion of his treatment and therapy. I asked him, what advice do you have for other kids who have had similar experiences as yours? And he said, to forget your bad memories, you have to make new good memories. So I hope that all of us can support our newcomer children in making new good memories here in Chicago. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy, for sharing about your work delivering mental health services using trauma-informed approaches. Your point that creating therapeutic environments or environments that promote wellness is not only the work of mental health providers is very powerful. And this point is very pertinent to schools and the environments they create that promote acceptance and wellness. Now, our final speaker is Stephanie Torres. Stephanie is an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Psychology in the College of Education at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Stephanie's research focuses on multi-systemic risk and resilience factors among low-income Latinx communities, particularly Latinx families impacted by immigration-related stress. She is interested in utilizing a community-based participatory research approach to develop, disseminate, and implement school and community-based programs that promote well-being and mental health among immigrant communities. She is also interested in avenues for promoting psychologists' involvement in policy and advocacy efforts. Stephanie is a licensed clinical psychologist, and her clinical work focuses on addressing trauma exposure among Latinx immigrant families. Stephanie?
Great. Thank you so much, Anne, for that great introduction. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Wonderful. So as a just a caveat, COVID finally got me after 2.5 years, so I'm not my best presenter self and a little bit nasally, so I apologize in advance for how I might sound throughout this presentation. But I'm really happy to be here. So again, my name is Dr. Stephanie Torres Peist, newly married, and today I'll be presenting on behalf of my colleagues at Ann and Robert H. Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago, as well as Loyola University. I'm currently an assistant professor at UIC, but I continue to collaborate with folks at CCR and at Loyola. And the title of the presentation today is Taught to Feel Free, Multi-Tiered School-Based Supports for Newcomer Youth. Let's go ahead and start the timer on my end. All right, so before we get started, I think one of the things that many folks have talked about throughout this presentation is the notion of what we like to call an invisible backpack, right? Children come into our offices, children come into our classrooms with a backpack full of experiences they've had along their journey, right? Positive and negative. So we think of things such as pre-migration, what we've experienced during transit, asylum and temporary resettlement, all the way to settlement, right? And as clinicians, as educators, as researchers, we all have a responsibility to help children kind of reshuffle what's in their backpack to make it a little bit easier to carry. And in some cases, help eliminate some of those stressors within the backpack that they carry. So this brings us to our multi-tiered systems of support, which I'm sure many of us are familiar with, right? MTSS. And MTSS, again, is thinking about what supports are helpful for individuals at a universal level, at a targeted level, and at an individualized level. Right. And so when we think of supports for our newcomer youth, I'm going to present a few things that are pertinent within our universal level, as well as our targeted supports level that I'll get into. And I think, like many other folks have stressed, it's incredibly important to have these supports, not only for folks who are in this individualized intervention, but really for every newcomer student that comes through our doors, as well as training folks who work with these students. So You Are Not Alone is kind of our first intervention that led to our Supporting Newcomer Youth series, which I'll talk about in a moment. YNA was formed after the 2016 presidential election, of course, given the amounts of distress, hotline calls, children being separated at the border, etc. And this was a collaboration between CCR and many community partners that led to multiple press conferences, as well as psychological first aid webinars and live streamed events that reached over 700 folks initially. And because of the success in YNA, it was something that just continued to grow. Right. And so in continued partnerships with community partners, this was kind of packaged as a community capacity building training with content focused, like you see on the left, strengths-based approaches, family and community focused frameworks, as well as a resilience framework. Again, really echoing what other folks have said about, perhaps students can't speak English very well, but they can speak 6 or 7 other languages, right? Like really drawing from that strengths-based resilience approach. And the training also used relevant models in psychological first aid, which you see here on the left. Psychological first aid is really to train non-mental health clinicians to help respond to distress, right? Especially in the aftermath of originally natural disasters. So really taking into account the principles of everybody needs these 5 things: safety and comfort, calmness, connectedness, self and community efficacy, as well as hope. And then also drawing from trauma-informed practices, which I won't go over. Amy covered that very well, but the 4 R's of trauma-informed practice, right? Thinking about how do we realize the impact of trauma, recognize the symptoms, respond, and most importantly, how do we resist re-traumatization very intentionally, especially when we think about our school spaces. So just a few statistics to kind of show the reach of YNA. So for trainings between 2017 to 2018, over 1,600 participants trained in 48 different events. And these were from educators to pediatricians to lawyers. And we have, there's a paper on YNA if folks are interested in reading more. But basically the gist of the paper are these two implications you see on the screen. One, that brief community capacity building trainings can improve community awareness, knowledge, attitudes, and practices in serving a highly stressed population, such as refugee and immigrant youth and families. And two, that organizational leadership may play a particularly important role by establishing mandatory trainings for frontline employees. And again, echoing that it's not only the job of licensed clinical psychologists or social workers, but basically anyone who is considered frontline, including our educators, our administrators, et cetera. And this brings us to our Supporting Newcomer Youth Wellness in Schools, or SNYWS. We love acronyms at CCR. So SNYWS really was founded from the trainings in YNA. It kind of evolved into the Supporting Newcomer Youth series. And basically this series is kind of a tier 1 intervention, right? So tier 1 in MTSS, again, is universal. YNA, although not directly always in the schools, was also a universal type of prevention, especially focused on non-mental health folks. So for this series specifically in tier 1, teams of 2 to 3 staff from each participating school, comprised of an EL teacher or coordinator from each school, plus 1 support person, which could be a social worker, counselor, or psychologist, would have 2 2-hour PD trainings. And core content areas were similar to what was taught in YNA, but something that was more focused on the actual school environment. So things such as terminology, identifying newcomers in schools, overview on the impact of stress and trauma on newcomers, trauma-informed strategies to support newcomers in schools, engagement of caregivers, self-care for adults. That's especially important thinking about secondary traumatic stress for folks who work on the front lines. And then available supports from OLSE, the Office of Language and Cultural Education, which works very closely with these tier 1 and 2 interventions, as well as an introduction to STRONG. And I'll talk about STRONG in one slide. STRONG is one of our tier 2 interventions, or one of our groups. So this series specifically is a tier 1, but also thinking about it as kind of a prerequisite to our tier 2 intervention, which is STRONG. So STRONG is supporting transition resilience of newcomer groups, or STRONG. And it's a great collaboration between folks you see at the bottom, School Mental Health Assist, National Center for School Mental Health, Western, Canadian counterparts, as well as the Center for Childhood Resilience, as well as Loyola. So what are the goals of STRONG? Again, STRONG is a tier 2 group intervention, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about how folks are selected if we have time in Q&A. So the goals of STRONG are to build newcomers' resilience and promote healthy adjustment to a new school and country, increase social support and connections among newcomer youth, develop newcomer strategies to cope with stress, build problem-solving and goal-setting skills, and increase newcomers' positive sense of identity and buffer newcomers from the impact of racism as well as xenophobia. And STRONG is really based off theoretical models of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, especially Bounce Back and CBITS, which basically just teaches kids how to cope with kind of negative thoughts, relaxation techniques, kind of processing what might have happened to them in terms of trauma or like a big stressor in their lives. And this is really, again, what STRONG is based off of. So we have elementary and high school versions, 2 different manuals. There's 10 student group sessions, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about what goes in those sessions, but mostly, like I mentioned, a lot of CBT, what are your inside and outside strengths? How do we change negative thoughts, relaxation techniques? How do we seek social support? What's cool about this intervention is it includes one individual journey narrative session. And so what that means, in traditional trauma treatments, we have something called a trauma narrative, which is basically when a child talks to a trusted adult, a therapist, to really process the thing that happened to them that was really scary or stressful, right? And for Strong specifically, it's an opportunity for that student to process their journey narrative from their country of origin to the United States, which may or may not be traumatic, right? But it gives that student an opportunity to talk, to draw about it, and to share kind of what they went through, and also, most importantly, what got them through it, again, focusing on strengths. And then in addition to that session, those 10 sessions and the one individual journey session, there's one parent group session and one teacher group session as well. Again, thinking about folks that surround the kiddo or the adolescent and how to really build that capacity of others. So briefly, our evaluation in Chicago, we started in 2019, severely interrupted by COVID-19. I'm happy to talk more about that. And then the year that we didn't have groups, we started that supporting newcomer series. And then this year, 2021, 2022, data is still being collected, but we have 5 schools and 22 students enrolled, and we're really excited to see how the intervention works, and as well as plans to continue this next year as a tier 2 intervention. I'm not going to share data because of time, but some of the positive student reported changes were we did see significant pre to post changes in the ability to cope, as well as school connectedness, which we know is incredibly important for newcomer youth. As part of the evaluation, there was also interviews and focus groups with folks. And you can kind of read these. These are quotes from students as well as parents on how they enjoyed the group. This I want to read because this is kind of what the title was based off of. So this is an elementary school student who completed Strong. And they said, I did it because I had not been here for that long. And when I arrived at the school, I feel it helped me. It was supposed to help me. When I first got here, I didn't have many friends, but when I was there, or for the time I was there, I was motivated or taught to feel free. So in general, kind of takeaways from this presentation, we all have a job to do to support newcomer students, right? I think that is the theme of all of the speakers today, whether that's in tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. But keep in mind that when we help students, there's always a way to become involved to create a better school climate for all folks, whether you're an administrator, an educator, or a psychologist or social worker. So thank you for paying attention. Sorry for the kind of rush towards the end, but I'm happy to answer any questions. Here are the 2 project leads from CCR. If you have any questions that I might not be able to answer, if you're interested more in learning about Strong at your school, etc. Thank you.
Goodness, I was on mute, sorry. Thank you, Stephanie, for your overview of the trauma-informed programs that you're piloting at CPS. You're not alone, and Strong for refugee and immigrant children and youth and their families. Sorry we didn't have enough more time to cover some of your data, which I think is very encouraging. I want to move on to the Q&A for folks that are able to stick around for a few more minutes. We have one question from our participants, and then I have also a few other questions if we have time. So the first question that we have is, does having an open case with DCFS hinder or help asylum-seeking families to obtain their immigration status?
So I'm much more familiar with the refugee process, more so than the asylum process, but but I believe that having an open DCFS case will not hinder it. However, if that person is charged with a crime of some sort, that will hinder your asylum case.
I'll just add to that, that if it's for the child themselves, if they have been the victim of abuse or neglect, and they are seeking asylum, they could then pursue what's called SIJS status. So for the child, it could be helpful.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone have any other comments or responses regarding this question? Okay, I have a couple of questions. My first question is, can you speak to the gender differences in the educational experiences of refugee, asylum seekers, and undocumented unaccompanied minors? What I'm getting at is, what are they? How do they play out with school engagement and the mental health implications?
I'm sure Nate has thoughts on this. I can start, and of course, at first I have to say that there's no generalization, right? I mean, we have kids coming from all different places around the world with different cultural experiences. So I hesitate to generalize, but I can give some examples where gender can play a role in access to education in their home country. Both in terms of maybe lack of access for girls, and also for older boys, as was mentioned earlier, the need to work, at a certain age might limit them from having access to education in their home country. So on both sides, you can see limits to access to education. The roles and responsibilities at home can be gender-based, and so there might be a pressure from the family, for a girl, for example, to be supporting needs in the home and therefore not able to focus on her education. I'll stop there and let somebody else speak.
Yeah, just to go with that last bit, I think one of the big pressures I see, especially with girls in the home, is childcare. If it's a larger family, and there's a lot of younger siblings, filling that role of being like a second mom in the house, especially if it's like a single mother, and mom's at work, immediately that responsibility is going to go to, say, the oldest daughter in the family. It really does depend.
I will share.
Go ahead, please.
So I will share my experience with accompanied minors. As I mentioned before, many of them are not really placed in their families. There is really this kind of responsibilities, taking care of children and all that doesn't really exist. They have to work quite often just to pay for their accommodation. But what I see, so we have definitely less girls as students in our school district, and much the numbers of boys are much bigger. But I see I do not want to be understood incorrectly, but the girls are more ambitious. They really want to get their education, and even they have to work the same as the male students. They will be more persistent in completing their education and finishing the schools, where young boys, or really young men, their focus is a little bit different. They want to work, they want to fulfill their obligation to send money. They think that school is not really that important. At least a couple times I received phone calls from the young men who told me that I'm stuck in that stupid school because of you. Their goal was different. They have different expectations. So I find girls more really willing to complete schools and have more responsibilities and more ambition than from our perspective, okay, because what ambition is for whom, that will be also a point of discussion, but generally let's say they are more successful in completing schools than the male students.
I just want to add to this whole situation, it might be helpful to look at some of the more recent populations that, at least that I'm working with, that we're working with. And so, the Afghanistan situation has had a dramatic effect on our schools and our community. And there are some very interesting, gender differences with this. Like Amy had mentioned before, a lot of girls who may have grown up in Taliban-controlled areas did not really have any schooling or did not have as much access to schooling. The boys in some of those areas may have only had schooling in Islamic schools or madrasas where they learned Quranic studies, but maybe did not even, learn or become literate in their native language, versus children who grew up in the cities like Kabul. They had much more access to what we would call a standard education. And so in those situations, I'd say, the playing field there academically is much more even. Folks who grew up in Kabul versus folks who may have grown up in rural communities or Taliban-led areas.
Thank you, Beata, Nathan, and Amy, who had to leave. So those are very important points that, there might be different expectations placed on boys and girls where they're perhaps pushed more to work, and where it might be easier for girls from some groups to complete high school and to complete school based on what they're expected, but also the type of educational foundation that they come with when they arrive in the United States. The last question that we had was actually focused, it was for you, Stephanie. You mentioned the mandatory trainings that you had kind of negotiated with CPS. And, we had also talked about, the importance of having a welcoming environment, and that the faculty and staff is able to really see the strengths and be welcoming with the students. So the question is, how have the mandatory trainings been received by CPS faculty and staff? How much acceptance are you getting when pushing for greater sensitivity, the presence of potential trauma, and need for a nurturing, empathetic educational environment? And that will be our last question.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'm happy to drop one of the papers on YNA in the chat because I think it explains a lot more. But I think in general, the acceptance was well received, right? I think with PDs, it's always difficult to give new trainings on top of an already stressed and pretty busy school body, right? But in general, we did see kind of pre and post changes in terms of like thoughts about immigrants or new strategies. I know that for some of the initial trainings, when I was still at CCR, so a couple of years ago, wasn't quite exactly this new series, but we would do a lot of activities where we would go around with poster walks and think about different trauma-informed strategies that folks could actually take home with them, right? So we also did see like some acceptance and some willingness to kind of take what they learned back into the classrooms, right? So we did see some good success with that, and some good attendance as well with our supporting newcomer youth wellness in school series. I know it's a mouthful. By way of example, 48 people attended the first training, which was like the kickoff. And then there was a second part of a kickoff, and then 2 learning PDs or PLCs. And the drop off was 48 to 41. Which is pretty good considering the 4 kind of meeting time requirement for folks. and we did see that the majority of folks found all the information, really, really helpful. They got new ideas, they got a handbook, as well got some introduction to Strong and how they could bring it to their own schools. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Really good acceptance though. It's really promising to see the summary of that data.
That's good. That's good. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you for staying later. I'm gonna have to schedule these for go back to 2 hours because it never seems to be enough time.
Mhm.
Thank you again, Nate, Beata, Amy, who had to leave, and you, Stephanie, for really set of very powerful presentations and discussion. I always say this at the end of each convening, but we end up covering very complex topics, and we never seem to have enough time. And so we want to provide folks with a lot of information, but at the same time, we kind of everybody ends up feeling a little bit like they're rushing to cover the information so that we can have time to discuss. And then things seem to get still feel a little rushed. Before you all move on to the rest of your day, please complete the survey for today's convening. You can access the survey via the QR code on this slide or the link provided in the chat. I'll provide that in a second. We value your feedback, and your feedback actually informs future convenings. On Tuesday, I will send you an email with a virtual swag bag for attending today's convening, PowerPoints and slides, and also and I will follow up the email with a link of a recording of this convening. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a good weekend.
I'm running. I'm running. I'm running. I'm running. So much time. Wait.